On a cold winter morning, years ago, I was in Kashmir. It's that northern part of India that for centuries has had a tragic history. Having suffered an oppressive Afghan rule, it was to continue its passage of pain in the 1800s under Ranjit Singh, the new Sikh ruler. In 1947, the life of this valley took another horrific turn, with entire villages being massacred, and Kashmir's accession to India was birthed in fire, plagued with suspicion and doubt. Since then, it's been a land bathed in white pristine snow that soaks the blood which is spilt on it with frightening regularity. Geographically, this land is located in a valley 1/5 the size of Ireland and is entered through a narrow mouth. The Pir Panjal Mountains flank it on the southwest and the mighty Himalayas on the northeastern side. A land of tragedy locked between mountains with a narrow mouth to enter it. A land of majestic beauty, water and mountains. And on that winter morning, I entered a garden. It started innocuously enough. Originally, one entered from water, but now a road had cut its first terrace. In a dry, cold landscape made of brown monochromes, I entered through a narrow entrance, much as if entering the valley, and rose from terrace to terrace. And as I did, water desiccated the land. It started as limpid pools, much like the rivers that meet the plains. But as the ground rose, the waters got turbulent. Like the mountains that engulfed the valley, the stately chinar trees, first just edging the composition and toying with the space, slowly took over and held the vertical sides. And in a heady rush, my mind started sensing the many plays being enacted. The paths, like mountain trails rising, with points to reflect upon and register the route traveled. The water controlled, at times almost restricted, and within it allowed to express some moments of joy. And when I reached the top, a small pavilion of great humility was located at the end of the journey, as if to say, it refused to be the culmination. For behind it were the Zabarwan hills, and at the mouth of the garden was the Dal Lake. And between this celestial occurrence was this life. Between mountains and water was the story of Kashmir, a land of great beauty, and yet on that somber winter evening, revealing the bones of its tragedy. This was Nishad Bagh, built centuries earlier in 1600s by Asif Khan as a pleasure garden. He could not have known then that the tragedy that was going to befell this beautiful land, for had not his people called it paradise on earth. And yet, 400 years later, at least to me, it was telling me the story of the anguished land and its soul. Many such experiences over the last many decades, including hearing about the heart-aching tale of Derek Jarman grasping for life and celebrating it, makes us contemplate what our roles as designers really is. I sense often that the art of making gardens has the responsibility, but also the ability of listening to the past, the present, and the future of the land, and with a swill of culture, anthropology, and politics, try and embed hopefully eternal stories that in time will tell tales for the keen listener. And yet, I struggle with this conversation by what I choose to call environmental white noise. White noise technically is sound that contains all audible frequency, which simply is to say that it contains all possible things that the ear can listen to, and yet it's composed such that it cannot discern any specifically. People use it to sleep. An environmental white noise then blocks us from hearing that which is specific and numbs us. I'm often surprised, even a bit hurt, when in the presence of a great tale unfolding in a garden, the conversation seems to only veer towards the environmental responsibility or the lack of it that the garden seems to display. Let me hasten to say emphatically that environmentally the world is in peril. I know it and I recognize this fact. Degraded air and water quality, scarcity of water, land contamination, deforestation, soil erosion, land use change, habitat and biodiversity loss are real. And we must be amongst those at the forefront to help in clarifying this discussion. But it's also true that along with this, the idea of poetics or abstraction or the true realization of the power of art often evades us in our garden. And we do not use this discipline to galvanize and infuse our spaces with hope and imagination that can at times be a relief or even a panacea to banal life. Confronted with a complex labyrinth of issues to grapple with, the design and the appreciation of landscapes falls in cracks of limiting binaries. The discussion often veers towards native flora or varying ideas of wilderness, pleasant composition, sustainability, the joy it brings to users, or the environmental concerns that the gardens address, but rarely do we recognize the large canvas, almost godly, unworldly canvas available to us that can encapsulate and attempt to grasp at the very idea of life with all its complex and myriad ingredients. This is the environmental noise that numbs us. Is the act of making gardens then about being skillful with plants and knowing them well, or knowing one's soil and water? Of course it is. But these are the tools, not the end. Are environmental concerns to be ignored? Never. But addressing them is the minimum ethics and responsibility of the job on hand, not the end. It is with these tools and ethics that the discipline demands that we embed our lands with abstract tales of man and his relationship with the land, but also about his relationship with his soul and his purpose of being. For us, whose stage is the spatial realm, cannot well be amongst its gatekeepers or its worthy actors if we do not use this space to try and create narratives of compassion, empathy, and hope. Great landscapes recognize the land, its possibilities, and then proceed to weave tales that diffuse the idea of time and help in decoding the very idea of life. On a hot, sweltering afternoon in 1980s, with temperatures soaring above 43 degrees Celsius, the hard basalt rock set them soaring even further. Standing in the bowels of this cauldron, my late father, then about 50 years old, told the even older client that he would convert this rock into a forest. The concerned client walked him quickly to some shade, as was possible in that furnace, and asked for some cold lemonade. The heat, he concluded, had affected my father's mind. However, being a student of Professor Brian Hackett, he believed in the power of sane and simple ecological actions and had the indomitable spirit that made him sure that if we all tried hard, the earth could be healed. Working with only untrained labor, he took 4 actions. Firstly, he picked all the soil on the shoulders of the dusty roads leading up to the quarry, and he had noticed that the stone dust supported enough weed growth and had some nutrients in it. He clothed carefully the rocks where he could with this soil. Then he asked the miners for dynamite and blasted the hard basalt wherever he could find a crack and packed it with some soil. A nearby stream where the water ran in the river and finally lost in the sea was commandeered, and some water was diverted to the quarry. And then with a hemp rope measuring about 10 to 12 meters, he made 3 people do almost a tribal dance over the land. And they marked, because of this method, a randomly generated grid, locations where he took pits for the trees in the rock. And then he waited. for the first rains. And sure enough, small weeds peeped from the quarry dust, providing a microclimate for other plants and also cooled the rocks. This he did for 8 years, religiously, visiting often, finding new places to plant, checking the health of what he planted. Today, it looks a bit like this. This was in the 80s. Since then, the client and his family have passed away. After a decade, a new owner sold it to another mining company. At our studio, some of us visit it every now and then, more as a way of tribute, and are touched to learn that despite the owners and the makers having gone, the new owners continue to honor this indomitable spirit and tend to the forest. They don't want to make it a tourist spot. It's hundreds of acres of untouched, self-sustaining forests, only to remind us that the earth can be healed. Timba, after 40 years of its making, stays as an exemplar in the country and also a case lesson of perseverance and faith, one that keeps inspiring us till date. With about twice the population of London, packed in less than half its land, is Mumbai, the maximum city of India. It's a city of commerce and it's a city of dreams. Its life is fast, so fast that it forgets its past even before it's registered, and onward it rushes in the quest of fame and money. The metropolis of Mumbai was not one landmass, but a conglomerate of 7 islands. In 1661, the marriage treaty of Charles II of England and Catherine, the daughter of the King of Portugal, placed some islands under the possession of the English Empire. A massive reclamation project in the 1800s fused these islands into one, and the opening of the Suez Canal a few decades later made Bombay, as it was called then, one of the most important seaports in the Arabian Sea. A century later, the port moved away, and Mumbai has since forgotten its maritime history and also the fact that it was made by fusing 7 islands. The port and the commercial advantage it gave soon made Mumbai, at least for a century, the Manchester of India. At its peak, 130 large mills employing thousands of people produced textile that was sent all over the world. Then, in the 1980s, a labor strike felled this behemoth forever. And one by one, the mills made way to new shiny glass buildings, and the city soon forgot its textile past. 25 times larger than Central Park in New York and spread over an area of 200,000 acres is the Borivali National Park. It sits at the heart of the city, comprising of thousands of species of trees, rare fauna, prehistoric caves and hills. It could well be the place where the relentless city takes a breath, and yet it just rushes along its edges and has no time for it. At another end of the city are the hanging gardens, so called because they were built on a hill in the late 1800s and over a massive water reservoir that fed water to that part of the city. A place of childhood memories, one where countless popular film romances were shot. Today, it is ignored. Once again, the city has no time for it. There are many such stories of the Dutch fort by the sea, or of the Oval Maidan, which once was part of the Esplanade and is a 22-acre green in the middle of the business district, or of the old Marine Drive along the sea and the planting that dotted its past. The city moves, lurches ahead, refusing to remember its roots, lest they cling on and pull it down. The traditional custodians of the past, museums, old books, old buildings, historical districts, are being torn asunder and left as unrecognizable wrecks. What then must be the role of gardens? Should it be a vehicle that listens to land only ecologically, or should it do so also culturally, politically, and anthropologically? On a narrow strip of land, right where the textile mill stood, we designed a public park. And we decided that in the times that we live in, it could well be a gentle repository of the many memories that the city had consigned away. In it, we decided to tell the story of the loss of the textile mills. The entrance gate, for example, is inscribed with the names of all the mills of that area. As you enter the park, 4 mill spires define the court. The floor of the park is done in small machine parts, bolts, screws set in concrete, as if to suggest that the city rises on the graveyard of the textile district, which in fact it does. A little further, the park rises, reminiscent of the Borivali National Park, and leads the visitor to a raised deck. The trees spring from the lower garden, reminding one perhaps of the hanging gardens. And then the garden descends and overlooks a plaza coded as if stacked with sea containers, a nod to the city's maritime history. At its rear are a grove of coconut trees, and behind it, the arc of the Marine Drive by the sea. Edging this composition are 7 quadrants, with a small boat as a bench. Each quadrant with the planned materials as perhaps one would have found on the 7 islands before the islands were fused. This small park moves on and reaches the oval of the esplanade, and in it is a sunken bowl where people lie and look at the sky. It's been many years since the park has opened, and people seem to enjoy it. But the real question is, does it connect them to the vignettes of the past? The truth is, we don't know. And just like any author who writes a book, we can hope it will find its users. But what we do know is that people are intrigued by the many compositions in the park. And perhaps this intrigue, this curiosity about the world we inhabit is a good starting point. One of the startling bits of news amidst the great grief in the last 2 years was that a lot of large businesses actually grew bigger in the pandemic. This was incomprehensible, but they did. Before the pandemic, 60 million Indians earned less than £2 a day. In the last 2 years, the number has doubled. And yet, the rich in India behave in manners that can only be called hedonistic. There are exceptions. A very large corporate house worth billions of pounds has in all its acts maintained a self-effacing image, contributing large effort and money in numerous significant charities and social development work. A few years back, we were invited to design the gardens of the new corporate offices. A few months prior to that, I with my colleague Vinay were in his hometown, the city of the Taj Mahal, in search of the many gardens that historically dotted the river when the Mughals ruled India. We came across this gem. This was Emperor Babur's first garden in India. Measuring 250 meters by 350 meters, it comprises of a series of walkways crisscrossing each other and making quadrants. The planting is in the sunken courts formed by these paths. We walked along the quadrants from one to the other, and in no time, something incredible started happening. We just lost sense of location. And these similar grids created a labyrinth in our mind that made us feel physically as if in ether, suspended in an infinite loop with only the sky as our reference. This was a simple and yet extremely powerful geometry. And this garden was uppermost in our mind when we started working on the office grounds. Located on a modest-sized plot were a set of simple buildings that comprised of the office and the other related functions. Using the structural grid of the buildings, we drew many grids, and having simplified them, defined innumerable paths. Some between two buildings, some around, some through, in ways so that the campus as such did not have a singular linear manner in which to traverse. Mood and serendipity define movement, leading to innumerable varying experiences. Having defined the paths, in the resulting quadrants, we embedded stories. Islands in water with grasses for the birds to breed. On other islands, we moved saplings from hundreds of kilometers and planted a rare tree, Ticomela undulata, or the bleeding rohido, called because of its brilliant red flowers. In another part, we built a trellised walkway with rudimentary construction steel, and adjacent to it are 9 quadrants. Each has a lost tree, a specimen to preserve a memory of trees that have disappeared in our landscapes. And next to each tree is a bench to perhaps talk, to converse with the tree. Next to the cafeteria, we planted a court that grows herbs, and adjacent to it, another one where on a good day, people can sit and have meals or a cup of tea. Elsewhere, on the parking slab in 6 inches of soil, we planted a grassland, which is crisscrossed by the beams of the slab, some that form the pathways. A recycled wood pavilion has become the dining space for the inhabitants. And an envelope of large trees and shrubs creates a world within. And within this world nestle many other worlds, separated by walks, worlds that talk about loss, memory, empathy, community, and the many ideas of ecology. Many stories then, humble voices, fractals of serendipity. An office garden has perhaps become a compendium of small novellas that evolve with time. And while they tell the stories that they do, they also allude to the ideas of restraint and good societal behavior. Completed almost 10 years ago, house next to a stream that floods part of the site every few years, and its gardens have slowly led the owners to start thinking of gifting it to the community as an art retreat when they grow older. It never started with that as an objective, but the conversations around it have presented this possibility today. It was a dusty site. The soil had been stripped of nutrients. The water had extremely high salinity. There was a raised plateau, and adjacent to it, another raised mound, which was separated by a shallow valley. And dropping rapidly away was the lower ground. The property was ringed by seemingly unending forest land leading to great views that were protected. Instinctively, the project seemed to want to straddle both the high grounds and really be a gallery from which to view the many theatrical forms of nature. Over time, the soil has improved, the groundwater is regularly replenished and so gotten a bit better. A tremendous and diverse biodiversity reigns the land. The land produces food. But it's not for these reasons that we think of this project with fondness. The house begins with a very formal, structured garden. A large space for gathering, dotted with hedges, announces the beginning of the space. A steel staircase penetrates the stone facade, and along the way, one starts seeing installed art. The bridge now exits the house and rides the cusp of nature. On the left is the wilderness and the fields that coalesce with the seemingly infinite forests that surround the site. Slightly closer is a pond that the lower bedrooms look into. But on the right is a precisely structured landscape. The edge of the pool becomes a stage, and beyond that, an amphitheater that often hosts great performances. The bridge now enters the house again, and along the way visits some art, and then rushes down, picking up pace, and in a mad spiral descends into the wilderness again as if free of its bondage. The spaces of the house then just wrap themselves around these incidents. The client has over the years expanded his role as an art patron and enjoys long discussions with clients and artists, inviting them to stay over and do installations at his house. 2 new installations by Jacques Kaufmann, the well-known ceramicist, one in the pond of thousands of ceramic heads that peer from the water, and one on the terrace along the bridge of seminal men and forms made of very primitive material, became a reason for me writing an essay. In the concluding paragraph, I said, once again, Udan, the name of the house, it means flight, seems to have risen from its deceptive calm and marked a moment. The journey of infinity will continue, and Jacques' work will be an important marker of it. They have added the punctuations that make the meaning of life clearer and more distilled. They have started conversations we did not know we could have, and they have given voice to those not heard. The landscape for us holds on to the story of nature, ordered and wild, contained and seemingly infinite, and using these as protagonists tells new tales. The growing art installations act as catalysts, but also as mediators in this theater. On another land, an elder in the family who commissioned us had planted orchards and fields. This had been tended with passion. The place to locate the house was much debated, and while this debate continued for months, we drew the land just to imbibe its spirit. We mapped the wave patterns that the trees created, or the way that the leaves fell and created patterns on the ground, or the sounds one heard as we traversed the land, or the way that the lower stories of the plants occupied the ground and made many such innumerable impressions of the land. What this perhaps did was to slow down our minds and make it keenly in tune with the words and the whispers of the land. Finally, a clearing with a row of trees was chosen. Carefully, the house was woven and braided amidst it. An old pond was expanded, and around it sat the dining and rather large home office space. It has an island in the middle, with an earth walkway that connects two sides of the water. A large scented maze with a tree that one day will become large and stately creates a spiral path that allows a meditative journey to the center where the family often sits. The fields move to another part of the site, and then this land is inscribed with large forms, almost celestial markings on the ground, dissected or desiccated by a canyon of green. Together, they form a canvas that speaks to the sky. The memory of the fields is evoked by the many quadrants that are planted with vegetables and produce for the kitchen or the livestock. And the composition is wrapped in a gown of large trees. A nascent landscape, still growing, but today it looks a bit like this. Landscapes for us have been spaces of environmental responsibility, but also stages to play out the stories that our times perhaps want to hear. Small kingdoms and fiefdoms have dotted the neighboring state north of where we live through history. It even today is replete with discarded, abandoned structures of royalty, big and small. It's a state of warriors, but also a state where men, like much in the country, have traditionally consigned women to roles that can only be a product of a feudal mind. We were invited to design the courts of one such fort that rose 100 feet along the side of a hill. It was to be modified to become a hotel. Having reactivated an ancient water system and building sumps to harness all the rainwater, we turned our attention to other parts of the palace. There was nothing left in the courts except evocative names. There was the royal court, or the lotus court, the ladies' court, and so on and so forth. For us, here was a chance to listen to these names and tell renewed tales. The royal court was paved in a black stone and subtly marked an orb etched on the ground. And at the edge of this orb, a white marble rough-hewn throne was located, as if to suggest that power is peripheral, not central, and really has limited meaning. An old swing in the ladies' court was restored. In this space, we designed a fountain where the water spews from the edges and gushes deep in the womb of the basin to suggest the manner in which women in such lands have forever taken on all that was meted to them and have internalized it and drawn strength to move on. In the lotus court, we imagined a languid lotus rill that snakes through the court and runs over 100 feet, water lazily running through it silently and calmly. On a lower ground, we planted an old world Persian garden laid in a grid with water being fed from the center. This grows the vegetables for the hotel. And in another unused part of the hotel, which can be seen from some of the upper terraces, we carved the rocks that we found abandoned at the site and made planters and planted them with sansevierias that looked like the headgear of warriors who are no longer needed and gaze at the valley waiting for an attack. It's been 2 decades now, and most people visiting the fort find these garden narratives something that makes them think and connects them to fragmented ideas of time and culture. Just before the pandemic halted the world in its tracks, we were commissioned to do a country retreat for a large family. It's a large land in which they wanted to build 2 homes, a pavilion for a family and friends to meet, a small temple, a theater. The work at the site is limping, but because we had all the time in the world, we've grown extremely fond of this project. So much so that even before the work actually began in earnest, we published an in-house book that maps the ideas of design that the project explores and imagines. We have had and continue to have many conversations around it, and some of us in the studio agree that this project perhaps encapsulates all that we understand of the profession. That's a tall order, and perhaps we are being indulgent. The project takes poor clay soil and improves it. It harnesses all the rainwater that is directed to 6 recharge wells that send the water to the aquifer. It uses a completely new plant palette of only native and wild flora that took forever to identify and source. And it plays with ideas of order and chaos, form and formlessness, of biodiversity, of produce, and of recycling. In the center of the land is a carefully edged lake that is designed to hide its ends and perimeter. It snakes and moves to make place for other stories of the land. Amidst the water are a few islands that screen parts of the project, but also become places for birds. Many pathways run around the land, and many more are discovered every time we go there. 3 perfect circles find their places in this wilderness. One is a scented labyrinth, another the place of theater, and the third a cacti garden. 3 squares, then sitting between their axes, become the quadrants of produce that grow vegetables and fruit. A sculpted garden gets created near the pavilion. And then the 2 houses, the temple, the pavilion, and other support-built structures find their place. And the land gets consumed by many ideas of planting trees, shrubs, and wild grasses. Every time we go there, we seem to find in the project a few words here, a few words there, sometimes a rhyme, sometimes a small tale, and depending on how you traverse it, it tells a new story. Still very much a sight, and recently planted some images. When the land is wounded, then its pain should move us so that we slowly try and heal it and help regain its strength. When we have lost our moorings and are misguided, the land can egg us to remind ourselves of our past and possibilities. And when surrounded by worldly ills and behavior unworthy of humanity, the land urges us to tell stories that can be read often and differently, reminding us of decency, empathy, and hope. And when we seek renewed purposes and need curiosity to be ignited, it joins us in a song and composes poetry to fill the silences in our being. But equally, the land at times becomes many characters so that conversations can be spontaneous, varied, and nuanced. And when, as people, we are trapped in a false sense of worth, the land becomes a mirror and demands that we introspect. And at other times, we fuse with the land while it reminds us that the world we live in is mixed with many voices, many people, united by our diversity, not deafened or waylaid by the environmental white noise. But finally, we pray that land always talks to us, not today, not with the voices of the past, but the many voices in the distant future, and reminds us the very meaning of life. Listening to the land then, but also listening to the conversations that seem laden in the air around it, or are buried deep in its gut, and encouraging those words to find a powerful voice is what we seem to be drawn to do. And when we tell these stories, we shut the white noise and try and feel with our bodies so that almost intuitively we are drawn to become mediums through which the tales of our land can be heard. In a recent book, when invited to write 5 things that garden designers and landscape architects must note, in one we wrote, finally, when it's all over, it's only the stories that will remain. We hear them when young, morals are imbibed, lessons learned. We gather them as we grow, tales of love, friendship, and hardships, and how to counter them, of greatness and of inspiration. They accompany us as faithful companions, silent till we wish them to speak. Like warm clothes on a cold winter day, our lives are layered with them. In a world numbed by the onslaught of mindless words and images, honest, powerful stories will be remembered. And if we want the world to heed us, we will have to learn to tell them of cities and their memories, about the fragility and the delight of nature, of our culture, and of our place in the world and its meanings. Every site, a page. Every project, many stories. Every element, a chapter, a poem, or even a soliloquy. Thank you very much.